So my topic rightfully for a food-related conference, I guess, is culture, eat strategy, and compliance for breakfast or tea or lunch or whatever. Just to start out with, what do I think of as culture? So culture, the easiest definition is culture is the way we do things around here, meaning in an organization. I found another interesting thought, which is culture is how companies create and preserve value through people. And there's lots of evidence. For example, culture can account for 20 to 30% of the differential between an organization in performance, between an organization with a healthy culture and with an organization which is culturally unremarkable. Culture, as concerning values, is essential to getting people to work together, maintaining organizational effectiveness, and therefore it's really necessary for delivering a strategy. And I think the most important thing is that when you see an organization with a healthy culture, it really unleashes a huge amount of potential, enthusiasm, differential activity that people might not otherwise do. And so when you have a shared purpose and a strong culture, your company is likely to be more effective. Just a word about me, if this would be working. Okay. So I'm an example of how you can live and adopt a country for over 30 years and still sound like you got off the boat yesterday, which is really annoying, I have to tell you. But I am a sort of a reformed corporate lawyer, I guess is one way of describing myself, or recovering. I used to say I was a recovering corporate lawyer, but I discovered after 10 years that you never actually recover from being a corporate lawyer. But my legal career, because most of it was in-house, and my first job as a lawyer was at Cadbury Schweppes at a time when there was a huge amount of malicious tampering going on, and so I rapidly got absorbed into the incident management, product recall, preparedness, and decision-making process from which, in a way, I never escaped. In the next two organizations I worked in, one was pharmaceutical, the other was petrochemical. I discovered when I got there that both of them, or each of them, had one of these King Kong crisis management manuals that would be useful to maybe hit an intruder with, but nobody would have time to read it. And so I, in both cases, managed to implement a global incident management program. So I guess incident management may come in handy, the expertise these days. But my main focus developed into ethics and integrity and leadership, and also I became convinced, and this from my legal background, that compliance and deterrence and all of these things really wasn't changing anybody's behavior, really, because they never thought anything bad would ever happen to them, and for a lot of other reasons. Some of you, if you were here last year, I think you may have heard my co-author, Professor Chris Hodges, talk about that. I'm the far less erudite member of the team, but anyway, I hope I will convince you. So we're going to talk about a bit more about the fact that culture matters and why. And then in the second part this afternoon, and also we'll talk about how you can measure culture, by the way. Everybody thinks you can't, but you can. And this afternoon, we'll talk a little bit more about how, so the ethical business practice, which is the basis of the work that Professor Hodges and I have done. So I find this is curious. I don't know if you can read the numbers in the red, but it doesn't really matter. I think the point is that people think that culture is important. Senior managers believe, these are 5 different surveys that were conducted. And what I find interesting is that, so 90% felt culture was important to improve the value of the company, but only 5% thought their culture was what it needed to be. In the Deloitte study, culture is really important, but we don't understand it. And even fewer thought that their organizations were excellent. Culture is critical to success, but our culture needs a major overhaul. Okay, I'm getting a bit of cognitive dissonance here. And yeah, 86% in the EY study, culture is vital to strategy and performance. Culture is extremely important to organizational performance, but our culture is not really aligned with our strategy. So there's a disconnect, and I think there are several reasons for that. One of them is it's in the too difficult box for many people. First of all, how do we know what our culture is? And really, when you come down to it, culture is created over time by the values and behaviors of management and leadership, in a way often unconsciously. I think most cultures, not all, there are certainly exceptions to that, but many cultures are kind of created unconsciously. People don't set out to create a particular culture. And also, I think it's been viewed as a soft skill or a soft issue, and I think the perception about that has finally changed. A little more evidence, and again, this is slightly, I think these are 2016, but there are plenty more things like this, that people feel that improving cultures improve their financial performance, and yeah, I think that an investment in culture pays off. But how do you make that investment? That's one of the things that we'll be talking about. A little bit closer to home, maybe, is this point about it driving business performance between lower and higher integrity cultures. And there's a reason for that. This is a corporate executive board study basically showing that companies with weak ethical cultures experience 10 times the number of misconduct than those with strong ethical cultures, and employees in high integrity cultures are far less likely to observe significant business misconduct like accounting irregularities, et cetera. One thing that's kind of interesting here is that in order for this to really be effective, as it says, the main gains in reporting rate don't emerge until employees' perceptions are most favorable about their culture. I think, although you can certainly within an organization, particularly one that's multinational, multicultural, have very big variations in what the culture is like from one place to the other, what you're really aiming for is to try to create the most healthy culture that you can in all senses and in all places. There's another reason why culture is important, and maybe more important, or certainly needs to be balanced with compliance. This is one of my favorite topics, or this is a summary of some of my favorite topics. People used to say, whenever there was a big scandal, you'd hear, oh, there was a bad apple, and there was a bad apple, they did this all by themselves, which, by the way, is almost never the case, that anybody does any misconduct by themselves, because you often need a whole lot of enablers around whatever the fraud or misconduct is, or people who at least know about it and are saying nothing, because they couldn't care less. We'll talk about that in a minute. But it's almost always the barrel. So you could say maybe there are three kinds of people in the world: those who will do the right thing no matter how difficult it is, those who will do the wrong thing no matter what. So we have a certain number of sociopaths and psychopaths in the population. Every time I say this, somebody says yes, and apparently there's a larger percentage amongst senior management, CEOs in particular, than in the general population. I actually don't think that's necessarily true, although I have seen some narcissists in my time, but and we're certainly seeing a few in the political landscape. We won't get into that. But I think the point is that the large mass of people in your organization have good values, they want to do the right thing, but there are so many forces, both within ourselves, cognitive forces that create human risk, organizational forces that can, and often they do this inadvertently. So some of my favorite ones. So authority, probably most of you have heard of the famous Stanley Milgram experiments, which are controversial, but I think they're the basic conclusion is valid, that people do tend to be more willing to do something if a person in authority, wearing a white coat or not, tells them to do it. And sometimes they tell them without realizing it. So I don't know how many times in my long career I sat through business meetings where the senior manager present would say, well, you've got to make the numbers. And most of them never said, but you have to do it ethically. Now they're starting to say that in large companies, certainly. But it was, here's the target and make it. And you'd see this people saying, but that target is unrealistic. And they'd say, I don't care, just do it. So you're essentially telling them to go out and commit whatever, mayhem in order to make the numbers. So authority is a big one. The other one that's interesting, if you want to see a funny video, the Solomon Asch experiments about conformity. So people being willing to disbelieve the evidence of their own eyes in order to conform with the group. And I think this is really powerful. I'm sure you've all seen it, experienced it. People do not want to stick their head above the parapet, generally, unless they're somebody who considers themselves like a thorn. I've always been considered the grain of sand in the oyster that makes the pearl. I kind of like that. But I think most people want a sense of belonging, and as we'll see in a while, that's a basic human need. They might not have the skills or knowledge. They may not know what they're supposed to do. They may not be capable of doing it for whatever reason. And then they might frame the decision in a way that crowds out whether or not it's the right thing to do or not. So there are plenty of examples of that in history that have caused some pretty weird things, like the Ford Pinto disaster, where for 10 years a bunch of, I'm sure, good God-fearing people, so to speak, sat around a table and thought, well, if we run the numbers, it's clear that if we have to retool this car, which explodes when somebody is involved in a rear-end collision because the petrol tank is in the back, it's going to cost us $11 per car over the life cycle of the car. On the other hand, if we pay out wrongful death cases over the same period, it's going to cost us less. So they kept manufacturing that car with that defect knowingly for years and killing people or maiming them until finally it stopped. But I don't think those people sitting around that table were evil. They were probably sitting there afraid of Lee Iacocca, who was saying, you have to make a car for under $1,000 because we have to, all those European hordes that are coming over and contaminating our market. So cost benefit is if you're sitting in a meeting and somebody is looking at a decision purely from a cost benefit perspective, think about it. Is it the right thing to do? And then finally, my favorite, and I think the most important, is a thing called the fudge factor. So that's the extent to which you can cheat and still feel good about yourself. We all have it, okay? We all have it. Can I cross the road against the light in London? Yes. In Switzerland? No. All these things, it's essentially our ability to rationalize doing something in order to get an advantage for ourselves or our friends. And that's where culture becomes so important. Because if you have a culture where everybody's doing it, or people are so upset and frustrated about the fact that they're not being paid fairly, etc., they're going to be able to rationalize their behavior and still feel good about themselves. And you don't want that. So I think, and that's Dan Ariely is the behavioral psychologist or behavioral economist who coined the phrase the fudge factor. And if you're interested, he's got an RSA animate on it. So if you just look Dan Ariely, he's much funnier than I am. Right, so the point here is that we need to concentrate our efforts on the large body of people who are trying to do the right thing. But that's not generally what we're doing in sort of compliance. We're trying to catch bad actors. We think that, in a way, the mindset has been, certainly in anti-corruption compliance, has been, we've got a whole bunch of criminals in this organization, and we've got to treat them like criminals, make sure they don't misbehave. And of course, people who are treated like criminals start to feel like they're not trusted, which they're not. So why would they feel that they were? So that's one thing, and we need to tailor our approaches here to really work with people who are trying to do the right thing and want to feel trusted and feel positive toward their organization. This is another reason. I don't know whether Chris showed you this last year, but so compliance will not succeed in a toxic culture. And one of the reasons is, and by toxic we say blame, this is something that we essentially stole from aviation safety. And I'm sure you have a similar thing in food safety. But basically, if you have a blame culture where people get their heads cut off if they come in and say, oops, I made a mistake, or if it's found out that they make a mistake, obviously people aren't willingly going to come in and say, I screwed up. So that means that before you find out about something, it's probably going to get worse than it would have needed to be. And once that happens and it finally comes out, chances are that the consequences, physical, financial, whatever, will be higher, and you will not have been able to mitigate those consequences which you would have been if you'd known sooner. So I think that it's really important to think that in that kind of an atmosphere, you're probably not going to be able to do very effective or credible root cause analyses. And to me, that's the really important thing. I've worked in, my last company, Borealis, was really into safety. And things went wrong. Of course, we had to be very conscious of it because if we blew up one of our facilities, people would die. But I started noticing that we'd be having these really calm conversations. People would come in and say, well, I did this and that, I shouldn't have done that, and we didn't follow this, and all of these things came together, and this is what happened. And we as a management team would say, okay, and are you sure you thought through this, and are those all the factors? What are you going to do about it? By when are you going to do that? Please come back and tell us in 6 months. And everybody kind of walked out with their heads intact, and we had faith that they were going to fix it. So I think it's an important point that you've got to eliminate blame out of your culture. And blame is a common thing. Right, this is, I hope I can keep you with me now. This is an adaptation of a thing called the 7 Levels model, which was created by a Brit from Hull named Richard Barrett in the 90s in order to measure culture in organizations. So here I'm going to talk a little bit about how to measure culture. This is an adaptation that I've made together with the Barrett Value Center. I'm not employed by them, by the way. I'm just trained in using their cultural measuring tools. And so I wanted to adapt this model to focus a bit more on ethics. Basically what the model says is, like Maslow, it's based on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. It says that individuals and organizations have to satisfy their survival, health and safety needs. They need to focus on belonging and sort of harmonious relationships, which is what you see there at level 2, and they need to have systems and processes that are working and functioning. So it's this is all about quality, high performance, etc. In those levels, if you have, you can have potentially limiting values, or these are values or behaviors that are blocking the organization. They're generally fear-driven, and they're blocking the organization in one way or the other. Those are the words in red. And if you have those, in this system it's called entropy, so it's essentially the amount of wasted energy, frustration, dysfunction in the organization, which is taking away from sort of moving forward in a positive way. There's a couple of words in orange there, which in the normal system they don't do that, but I find, for example, loyalty is a double-edged sword. People might, it's a positive value, but if somebody feels loyalty to a friend, so they lie in order to protect that person, loyalty can be a potentially limiting value. Once these sort of deficiency needs are satisfied, an organization grows, transforms, and evolves, and the top 3 levels, or the 3 levels, 5, 6, and 7, are about the common good. There would be what Maslow would have considered self-actualization. Level 5 is a really important level in an organization because it's about having a sense of internal cohesion. We all know we have shared vision, we know what we're doing, where we're going, what our goals are, and we want to make a difference. So we have things like transparency, humor, fun, things that really allow us to work together in the same cause. And then level 6 starts to open out, thinking about your supply chain, your strategic partners, your actual physical environment. And then level 7 is about long-term perspective and the planet, sustainability, etc. The point is that someone in the organization needs to be thinking about each one of these levels. So if you had an organization that had all of its values up in levels 5, 6, and 7, and nobody was minding the store, thinking about humans' relationships and the systems, you can understand that the organization wouldn't be working too well. But the same thing would happen if you are only focused on money and systems, because people won't feel appreciated. You won't be igniting all of that energy and enthusiasm. So why am I showing you this? Because I want to show you actually how you use this to measure culture. So this is an example of a department in a bigger organization. The levels are the same as what I told you earlier. The blue dots are positive values, and the white dots are potentially limiting values. In order to do this, you ask 3 questions. What are your top 10 personal values? People pick out of a list from a link. What are the top 10 values and behaviors that you experience from day to day in your work, in your organization? And what are the top 10 values that you think would really allow your organization to reach its highest potential? So you can read these things in a whole lot of different ways, but basically you're looking for the lowest possible level of this dysfunction. 34% is very high. I'll show you some food industry statistics, which are amalgamated. They're not, so you're looking for somewhere between, say, 10 and 15% entropy is probably okay. I've never seen an organization with 0, and if I did, I'd start to worry that nobody was telling the truth, I think. But so here you have an example of a group of people, and there's 111 people who've chosen the values that you see on the list here, and they're all very positive values: fairness, trust, positive attitude, humor, fun, flexible, reliable. But the only value, the only personal value that they see in the current culture and the desired culture is flexible, so that's good. But if you look at the list of the current culture values, that's not a very happy picture. Bureaucracy, silo mentality. Cost reduction, by the way, before 2008, before the financial crisis, was considered a positive value. Then when we did workshops, people kept saying, too much cost reduction, I don't have enough resources to do my job anymore. So it's now considered a potentially limiting. And by the way, we say potentially limiting because you have to use this information to have conversations with people. You don't just say this is the answer and that's the end of it. A lot of companies use this to figure out what their core values are. Many organizations, thousands and thousands of different kinds of organizations have used this tool, and they'll maybe look over a period of years to see if the values that they're trying to embed are really embedding, and if the issues that they found maybe at the beginning are going away. Interesting thing about this profile is you've got the words in orange: professionalism, working together, customer satisfaction, and flexible, are also present in the desired culture. So there seems to be a certain feeling that, well, we are doing a lot of the right things, but we need to get rid of all this noise and frustration that's going on in the organization. And the reason I like this tool more than anything else is it gives you the answers, the solutions to the problems. It doesn't just leave you thinking, oh dear, we've got all these problems. And so in this case, first of all, you see all those dots at level 4. In the desired culture, that means there's a lot of energy for change. People want a lot of change, which isn't surprising given the profile that you've got there. And if you look at what the words in black are, there are things like continuous improvement, collaborative, continuous learning. So clearly this is an organization where people feel that they're not really having a chance to learn from their mistakes and improve, and they're not very engaged, so they're looking to be more engaged. Leading by example, I worked with this organization, so I know that this is a reference to the fact that they want their leaders to lead by example. So anyway, this is the point about this is you can measure culture, and this is one very nice way of doing it. Just to bring this into, this is a consolidated report between 2007 and 14 of 83 organizations from 27 countries in the food and drink industry, and just a kind of average look at the culture. So again, you've got quite a positive, you've got quite a positive sense of the values of the people in the industry, the values that they chose. You don't have one thing I find interesting there, you don't have any levels 5, 6, and 7 values in the current culture. It's creeping up, and people want more to see more of this in the desired. And you have a lot of alignment between how people see their organizations today and how they want them to be. In terms of the amount of dysfunction, which I'm sure you're going to ask me, the average is, I think, 19% over the period, and it ranged from, I think, 14 to 22%. So actually up to 30. So the bulk of the organizations did have issues that needed to be dealt with, but there weren't too many in the crisis area, which is nice. You can ask me more questions about this. This comes again from looking at the model that I showed you earlier and how this amount of dysfunction can affect employee engagement. And employee engagement, again, is one of those things that is directly related to trust, et cetera. But thinking back to what I said about the fudge factor, in an organization that has very high cultural risk or where people are highly disengaged, it's really easy to rationalize bad behavior. So you don't want to get into that situation. Yeah, so this is just another way of saying your culture is important if you want people to be able to do the right thing. Regulators are finally realizing that culture is important. This is from the FRC in the UK, the Financial Regulatory. I know they're themselves having their issues, but they've they finally recognized a few years ago that culture was an important corporate asset and a source of competitive advantage, and it needs to be protected. I thought it was interesting. They said directors should not wait for a crisis before they focus on corporate culture. Unfortunately, they had to say that because I think most organizations don't. Then a bit later, they made it actually in terms of guidance to the boards, they said that the board is expected to assess and monitor culture for alignment between purpose and values. And purpose is another one of those things that is got a lot of attention now, that really having a really strong, engaging purpose is a way of motivating people in a positive sense. So I think that it is finally the case that regulators have come around, and some regulators. And this was actually created by the Scottish EPA many years ago. In fact, I met the gentleman who wrote this. Through working with Professor Hodges, I've come in contact with a lot of regulators recently in various different industries. And I have to say that they are themselves realizing that they have to treat organizations differently depending on how that organization is behaving, trying to behave, et cetera. And this is one of the things that we're saying, and that is that if you treat an organization, for example, who's really a champion of doing the right thing and doing all of the things to promote best practice, et cetera, if you treat that organization like a criminal, you're going to those people are going to say, well, you know, they might say, why am I bothering? Certainly it's going to be demoralizing. So yes, you have to act very strongly against people who are either behaving with criminal intent or just couldn't care less. But if you punish people and organizations, and again, this comes from aviation safety, who are trying to do the right thing, it will have the opposite effect. So I'd like to, I don't think there's about 2 minutes left for questions if we're going to keep up to the time. But shall we see if there are any questions?
Absolutely, Ruth, thank you so much. Obviously, those of you who have studied your agenda will know that we've got another session after lunch. So we can either take some very quick questions here, or you can save up your questions for a more in-depth Q&A session afterwards when we talk about some more practical things about how to get started. But if anybody has got a burning question that they worry they might have forgotten after lunch with a post-lunch slumber, or I think maybe we'll just save them up because we finished beautifully on time with about 20 seconds to spare. So please give a very big warm welcome. Warm thank you.